Okay, I think that's as close to 6 o'clock that we can, I think that's as close to 6 o'clock that we can wait. So, um, good evening, everybody. Tonight we're thrilled to be joined by Ian White, the Dormouse Officer for the People's Trust for Endangered Species. Ian will tell us all about the charming and rare dormice and the telltale signs of if they are present in your woods, why populations are declining, and what we as SWOG members can do to help. So, Ian, I'll pass over to you.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Delighted that so many people have an interest in Hazel Dormice. I must admit, I've been working on the species for probably over 20 years now, and I must admit they still fascinate. And they're quite a remarkable species because they work on so many levels. So I'll share with you what I suppose some of my experiences tonight, and also how you might help them perhaps in your woodlands themselves. First and foremost, let's start off with this, that dormice are not mice. It might sound a bit odd because there is, after all, mice in the title, but it's thought where the word mouse comes from is a derivation of the Greek word humus, which means earth, because the Greeks used to see small brown animals jumping out of the earth, and they thought that the earth itself gave rise to small brown animals. So mouse merely just means a small brown animal, really, which a dormouse is obviously one. Why I don't really like people getting them confused is that people that often see mice and their brethren rats as well as pest species, and there's very good reason for that. So both mice and rats that we kind of think of come under a family called Muridae, and they're quite a big group. There's about 700 odd species worldwide. But I suppose the key thing about them really is that if they have abundant food sources and they have abundant nesting opportunities, they can basically crank their breeding up to take advantage of that. And pretty much a wood mouse, say, or a rat, once they've given birth to one litter, will pretty much be pregnant with the next. So that means their breeding potential is huge. So, for example, if you start off in spring with a pair of brown rats, and they have access to unlimited food, perfect nesting sites, and no predation, at the end of a year, you will have 1.5 million rats. So the breeding potential is vast. And actually, that's one of the reasons they're a pest species. And I know a couple of years ago, you might have seen some YouTube videos of the problems they had in Australia, where they had bumper harvests, they had forest fires over there that knocked out a lot of the predators, and the mouse populations just went ballistic. And there are some videos certainly on YouTube that kind of highlight and show that. Let's say dormice are different. So this is a species. I suppose there's two things really that kind of drive dormice ecology. One is their diet. So that the dormice lack a cecum. So the cecum is the part of the gut in an animal that allows an animal to digest cellulose. Because dormice are limited in their ability to digest cellulose, that kind of pushes them onto a higher quality diet. So they can't eat grass, they can't eat leaves, but also what they be feeding on is pollen from flowers, nectar from flowers, invertebrates perhaps. And in the autumn, they'll feed on blackberries, nuts, obviously hazelnuts, hawthorn, berries, but they are really pushed into a more specialized foods they rely on. The other thing about dormice really that kind of drives their ecology is they're pretty much fully arboreal. So over winter they'll hibernate on the ground, but when they're active in spring, summer, and autumn, they're living in the tree and shrub canopy, and they seem to prefer not to come to ground. So they're living in the tree and shrub canopy. That's where they find their food sources. That's where they build their nests. And that's pretty much where they spend their waking hours. So dormice, as I say, are what's known as successional feeders. So when they wake up in spring, the blackthorn probably is a little bit too early for them, but probably the first thing they'll start feeding on is perhaps oak flowers or hawthorn flowers. And then as summer progresses, they'll move on to feeding perhaps on sycamore flowers. They'll be feeding on the aphids in sycamore trees. Come summer, there's often a little bit of a gap where there's not really anything much flowering. So they'll probably move more onto invertebrates at that point. And then, of course, in the autumn, they'll be feeding on blackberries, on oats, on hazelnuts, and the berries and fruit mass that are produced in the autumn. But what it means is that because no one plant will supply a food source for dormice throughout their active period. They kind of need quite a diverse woodland. So they need a broad range of plants, because a broad range of plants gives a broad range of flowers and also a broad range of invertebrates they can feed on. So they like quite diverse woodlands to provide this abundant food source. And I have to say, one of the excellent plants, I think, for dormice is bramble or blackberry, because it has quite a long flower and a long fruiting season, and that is perhaps one plant that does provide quite a lot of food for dormice. So when, just I've already said that dormice, when they're over the spring, summer months, when they're active, they'll be in the tree and shrub canopy. But when they, this is a species that hibernates. We only have two terrestrial mammals that hibernate, the other one being the hedgehog. So come autumn, dormice will start be feeding on hazelnuts and on berries to actually put weight on, to store or build up fat reserves within their body. And then they use those fat reserves to kind of see them through the winter months when they go into hibernation. And that's the one, that is a period when they come down from the tree and shrub canopy, move to the ground, they'll build a nest on the ground, and they'll go into hibernation. So hibernation is often called they go into a sleep. It's not a sleep, it's quite a profound physiological change. Their heart rate will drop from about 300 beats a minute to about 2 or 3 beats a minute. Their body temperature will drop to ambient temperature, and they're pretty much going to a state of suspended animation. This isn't a continuous state. They will wake up during this hibernation period, probably to excrete waste products. But one of the issues we are starting to see with dormice is we seem to have in periods where we have warmer and more mild winters, and potentially these could push dormice out of hibernation more frequently. I mean, they'll potentially go back into it again, but of course, all of those waking periods are forced upon the dormice over winter. Basically means they lose energy. And they can only do that so many times, or they simply run out of energy. So one of the things that slows dormice down, because they hibernate, because they require this kind of successional food source, is they're actually quite slow breeders. So dormice generally will have only a single litter of pups a year. They usually have 4 young. I generally think of dormice breeding in terms of months. So they'll mate, the young will be born after about a month. The young will be weaned after a further month, and often even once they've weaned, the animals will stay with their mum for a further month to gain experience, so they're better able to survive when they become independent and move into the wild. So potentially from dormice mating to animals becoming fully independent can be 3 months. So in essence, you've only got a fairly limited period, because dormice usually are out of hibernation by about May, and they're usually looking to go back into hibernation perhaps late October, mid-November. So you really haven't got long for them to produce multiple litters. So generally, dormice will only have a single litter in a year. But what's different, I suppose, from, as I said earlier, with mice and rats, is actually they will churn a litter out, and they'll pretty much be pregnant with the next one. With dormice, it's different. There's quite a lot of maternal care goes into the young animals. So when they're ready to become independent, they're much better able to fend for themselves. And I must admit, I often have described on the media that perhaps one thing we should think a little bit about dormice is this is a very classic sort of strategy in terms of the maternals or the mother spending time looking after and bringing up the young. And in some ways, they share that similarity with us, because we do exactly the same. We have few young, but we spend a lot of time looking after them. Perhaps in some instances a little bit too much, but perhaps dormice share some of our own characteristics as well. So dormice, as I said, are fully arboreal. I suppose the animal we tend most to associate living in shrub canopies is the grey squirrel, and we can quite happily see grey squirrel leaping from tree to tree. But grey squirrels are much bigger than dormice. They're only about 80 millimeters long. And from a dormice point of view, leaping from branch to branch is quite tricky when you're that small. So because dormice are arboreal, to move around a habitat, they need a well-connected canopy, so they can move around. They don't, as I say, don't particularly well jump from branch to branch, because it's challenging for them. And also because they're coming out at night as well, So having a well-connected habitat for dormice both to occupy and to disperse in is pretty important, really, for an animal that really doesn't like coming to ground. So, and it's also another reason that the blackberry is actually very good for dormice, because if you look at a big bramble thicket and get down on your hands and knees, you've basically got this interconnected network of branches just much lower down. It's actually quite low down and close to the ground, which again, making bramble a very good plant as a safe area for dormice, to feeding, but also for safe nesting sites as well. So this sort of habitat is fairly well, excellent habitat really for dormice. So you've got it appears from the photograph, this is quite a diverse habitat. There's a broad range of plants here. There's some dense understory shrubs. You've got climbers linking the understory shrubs into the canopy. You've got pretty diverse woodland that dormice can both move around in and also feed in as well. So this is very typical dormice habitat. I should say that this photograph was taken at woodland on the Isle of Wight, and the great advantage on the Isle of Wight is that there are no native deer present, or no wild native deer present, I should say. So one of the main problems we have on the mainland of trying to create this sort of habitat is actually you do the work to create the opportunity for the scrubby habit to grow through, and that regenerating scrub can quite easily be eaten off by deer. So this, as I say, this kind of diverse structural woodland can be quite hard to maintain in the presence of high deer numbers. So I suppose, as I say, a brief outline of dormice ecology, and I suppose the first question really is is there a problem? Are we worried about this species? Are our concerns valid, or actually is it doing quite nicely? Thank you. I suppose we could look back at a paper that was written in 1885, and what this was a chap, George Rope, who basically wrote to his mates around the country and said that actually how are dormice faring in your area, and he had reports back or responses back from people within pretty much most of the counties of the UK, and from that we could make up the map that's shown there on the left hand side, which pretty much shows where dormice were considered to be frequent, where they were recorded occasionally, where they were considered rare, and also obviously where they're absent. So dormice have never been recorded in Scotland. The only counties in England and Wales that dormice appeared absent from in 1885 was Norfolk and Anglesey. Otherwise, they were recorded in every county of England and Wales. So that's pretty much the state of dormice about 100 years ago. But even within that report, there were some comments that actually the dormice perhaps weren't as common in some counties as perhaps they have been found previously. And this paper got sent to me in some time ago. This is from Country Life in 1945. And this was actually from a farmer in Hampshire who, before the war, had walked around his fields and found a fair number of dormouse nests in his hedges and hedgerows. But after the war, he was finding far fewer. So again, hence the title of the article, Disappearing Dormouse. Before the war, so he'd had evidence of dormouse. After the war, there didn't seem to be quite so much. So on the fact that there was evidence of kind of this declining population, dormice became protected species in 1988. They featured on the Wildlife and Countryside Act that basically then came a fair degree of protection for dormice. It was illegal to harm dormice, and also illegal to destroy the habitat and destroy the places in which they were living. So now we know a lot more because we've done a lot more survey work around dormice, and we now know the distribution map looks pretty much like this. And the key feature here really is that in 100 years we've lost dormice from most Midland and Northern counties. In fact, in 100 years we've lost dormice from 20 English counties. Still considered to be relatively widespread throughout Wales. Still appear to be reasonably good numbers in the southern counties, but as I say, there is now this big gap in the north and in the Midlands. And it's all very nice to say there's a population in Cumbria, but it is just that. There is a single population in Cumbria. Up to 2015, we had a population in Northumberland. That was lost. I say around about 2015. So pretty much, as I say, this is now confined to be a southern species, whereas 100 years ago, as I say, it was widespread throughout England and Wales. And that's kind of shown a range contraction in 100 years. We've also got quite a lot of information from a program called the National Dormouse Monitoring Program, where we ask volunteers to put up these dormouse nest boxes in woodlands where they know dormice are. And they then check these boxes about once a month throughout their active period. That data is sent to us at People's Trust for Endangered Species, and this gives us an indication of the current dormouse population trends. We do have a dormouse training log. I've said that dormice are highly protected, so to check nest boxes, you do need to have a dormouse license from either Natural England or Natural Resources Wales to basically allow you to check what could be a dormouse nest inside. So as I said, these are highly protected animals. You do need a license to work with them. We developed a dormouse training log some years ago. I train an awful lot of people, I must admit, and at times I do. It almost seems like I've got more people wanting to train to do work with dormice than we actually have dormice available. But it's great that so many people are interested in getting involved with the species. So the information that we have from a 30-year data set, the NDMP, is not good. So we being People Trust for Endangered Species, produce a report on the state of Britain's dormice. We do this about every 3 years. The last one was produced in 2023. And in that one, basically, we showed that dormice have declined in the UK by 70% since the year 2000. And we kind of bandy these figures around quite glibly, but actually 70% since the year 2000 is about 2/3 of the population in 25 years, which actually is pretty dramatic. It doesn't take a genius to work out that if that carries on without either a change in our conservation strategy or a lot more effort in terms of trying to help this species, there's a real chance that we can lose dormice in the UK. So dormice are decline quite dramatically, both in population and also in range as well. So this is undoubtedly a species of conservation concern that if we want to keep it in our country, we need to address reasons for its decline and start to take it more seriously. So dormice are very much associated with hazel coppice. I mean, it's even in the name, it's called the Hazel Dormouse, and they're very much associated with hazel coppice. On one hand, hazel coppice is a very good habitat for dormice, but I think also probably the main reason of that association is the fact that in times past, agricultural workers would be in the fields in the summer collecting or sowing food to harvest, or in the autumn, and they would be out harvesting that. And when they came into work in the woodlands, they would work in these woodlands over the late autumn and winter months. And of course, that was the time when dormice were hibernating on the ground. So they'd be cutting the coppice product and finding dormice in these coppice woodlands. So the reason for their association with hazel coppice is, one, it's a very good habitat, but also it's because that's where people were finding them. My suspicion would be you'd probably find just as many in good big bramble thickets that you would in hazel coppice, but of course we don't cut bramble in quite the same way that we cut coppice. The reason coppice is very good for dormice is that, again, we do it slightly differently these days, but in times past when we used to manage our coppice woodlands quite actively, coppice woodlands are very valuable in terms of they gave you a product in terms of the timber or the wood that came out of them. You could make things in terms of hurdles, in terms of firewood, in terms of thatching spars. A whole host of material could be made from coppice. So actually, it was quite a valuable commodity to have a coppice woodland. And of course, when you went to cut a coppice woodland, it was all done by hand, not by chainsaw. And a coppice worker cutting coppice with a hand tool could manage about 1 hectare. That's 100 meters by 100 meters in a season. That's all he could do. And of course, he wouldn't just cut 1 hectare. He would want some hedging stakes. So he'd go and cut some hedging stakes from a right age patch of coppice. He'd want some heathers for the top. So he'd go and cut another patch. But to get that product, he might want some firewood. So he'd be cutting some older stuff for firewood. He might want some charcoal, cut the same reason. So what a coppice woodland was kind of a mosaic of different age coppice coops that had been cut. And of course, different age coppice coops would have plants and shrubs maturing and flowering and fruiting at different times. which was perfect from a dormice point of view. They had a well-connected shrub story to kind of move around in, and they had a diverse range of plants within the coppice woodland to feed on at different times. So coppice is ideal for dormice, but unfortunately we don't quite manage our coppice woodlands in perhaps the way we once did. So when you first cut a coppice, it's basically quite a dramatic process. Often public don't like it very much because they think you're destroying the wood. Whereas actually what you're not destroying the wood, of course. Actually what you're doing is allowing the wood to regenerate. So this is what you first get after you do the first cut and cut your coppice down. Generally the season after, you'll get the flush of understory flowers, in this case wood anemone. So a lovely carpet of wood anemone before any of the coppices start to regrow at all. Moving on to the next stage is, you can cut. We can have some quite old stools, and you can see just from that picture kind of how productive it is, how quickly it comes back, and you've got all those new young shoots coming through and growing up quite quickly. And as I say, within 4 or 5 years, you'd have a product you could take out of that if you wanted hazel rods of that size. But it does start to regenerate very, very quickly. And then the early stage you tend to get for coppice is this bramble tends to take over, because bramble usually reacts to the light. It becomes virtually impenetrable to anyone at all. So this is probably about 3 year stage, perhaps 3-4 year stage after it's been cut. But you've got this dense stand of bramble with the hazel kind of growing through. Again, perfect for dormice. You've got feeding opportunity in the bramble. You've got nesting opportunity in the bramble, and you've got this connected network of dormice to move around in. So they've got feeding opportunities, they've got safe nesting sites, and they've got this connectivity they need. So that's great from a dormouse point of view. Then you move on, and what happens as you move on is the hazel slowly grows up, starts to shade out the bramble until you reach this stage at around 12 to 15 years, perhaps, depending on the soils, where all the brambles now disappeared. This is probably a bit later stage. That's possibly kind of hedging stakes of that sort of age. That's probably 12, 15 years maybe. But again, much easier to get into, much easier to cut. From a dormouse point of view, you've still got retaining that connectivity at a higher level. You've still probably got a degree of diversity around the plants moving around. When that comes into leaf, there'll be invertebrates feeding on the hazel again that dormice can feed on. And of course, there'll be hazelnuts produced in the autumn that they can feed on as well. So still well connected, still quite good from a productivity point of view, and that's still quite good from a dormouse point of view. It's also the stage, obviously, that if we're going to put nest boxes up as well, this is obviously also a stage where nest boxes tend to go in because we can get into it. No one generally puts nest boxes up in that previous stage woodland because it's quite hard battling through that dense bramble to get boxes up. So we have more experience of what dormice do in this sort of habitat than we do in the very bramble-dominated ones. But if you tend to leave hazel coppice, what tends to happen is that the branches become bigger, older, heavier. They tend to start to grow towards the light. And what can happen there is actually the stalls then start to become unstable and they start to thin out. And unfortunately, many hazel coops in southern England, certainly, and I suspect many other areas as well, start to look like this, which is derelict hazel, where the trees are probably quite productive in terms of production of hazelnuts because you've got big old vigorous trees in lots of light, but what they're lacking is any connectivity. So it might be great for dormice from a feeding point of view, but it's not great for dormice because there's all the connectivity has kind of started to break down. So derelict hazel, as I say, is not great for them because they simply can't get around to the food sources they need. So good thing about hazel coppice is ideally we want to have the kind of mixed age coops within a woodland to create, as I say, an aged woodland mosaic with it, but in a relatively small area. A variety of shrub and shrub species that are flowering and fruiting at different times. And again, need to be in a relatively small area. Dormice are generally considered relatively sedentary. They don't travel that far. Trying to have a fairly small coop size, again, which is how you maintain the kind of mixed age coops. and keep connectivity at the kind of the scrub or shrub stage, to again allow dormice to get around the habitat. And often what you find is actually perhaps you could retain some older hazel at the edge of the coops. They'll often fruit very well, but as I say, they ideally not be isolated, so dormice can actually get to that tree and make advantage of that. So this coppice can be very good, but it needs to be considered most certainly. So, but there are problems with coppice, and I must admit I'm seeing more and more people very excitedly showing me that they've done a bit of coppicing and actually thinking this really isn't great at all. It's actually you've almost kind of wasted your time. If you're doing it yourself, is one thing. If you don't do coppice, or if you pay a contractor to coppice your bit of woodland for you, it's quite expensive. Perhaps, depending on your contractor, perhaps £3,000 for a quarter of a hectare to coppice a plot. Unless you're thinking about where to do it, the coppice plot could be isolated within your woodland, which again might look very nice, but if there's no connectivity for dormice to actually get there, it's almost pointless. Coppicing itself doesn't really enhance connectivity. It might enhance connectivity within the coop, but it doesn't enhance it beyond it. One other thing you have to check, of course, if you're trying to create or manage coppice, is you have to manage the canopy shading above. Certainly from a conservation point of view, and almost more so from a productivity point of view, is you definitely need to thin canopy to basically allow light into the woodland floor to allow that coppice to regrow and start to regrow underneath. I mentioned deer. Almost certainly in southern England, if you do any coppicing, you will need to protect it from deer. I have certainly heard that in areas of Suffolk, if you coppice a woodland and don't fence it from deer, then all you're doing is creating wood pasture. It'll just be browsed off. The continual browsing will kill coppice stalls, and you'll be ending up, I say, literally wood pasture. So again, the other thing I've seen quite a lot in coppice recently in coppice is people don't seem to gap up anymore. So we coppice, we think we've done the job, walk away from it, and kind of don't revisit. We don't gap up. We don't look at if we are going to gap up, we don't look at where those plants are coming from. Something else, as I say, we don't particularly consider. Coppicing produces an awful lot of material. What do we do with it? Do we burn it? Do we kind of chip it? Do we stack it in windrows? How do we manage the product coming out? I mean, if we can actually use it for product, then great. But generally, well, often certainly from a conservation point of view, we tend not to. We tend to say, how do we get rid of this? And that can actually kind of lead to eutrophication of the soil, so increasing the nutrient level of the soil. And historically, coppice didn't increase eutrophication because all the product was removed when the coppice or the coppice coop was cut. And in many ways, as I say, these days there's not that many drivers for rotational coppice. Again, at one time, the wood was valuable. We used to take timber out of coppice as a driver. We used to make use of it, whereas actually the drivers for rotational coppice now tend to disappear. So I say we as conservation charities certainly aren't immune from challenges around doing coppice. I mean, the picture I show there is a woodland that PTS manage, and we did some coppice in there 10 or 15 years ago now. And we cut all the coppice down. We did some layering to try and increase the stall density, but we didn't actually go back and check it to see what had taken. We didn't. I suppose we kind of just did it and left it really in the hope that it would kind of sort itself out. Well, the reality is it won't. We've now got encroachment of sycamore into it, which is killing off some of the hazel stalls. So I think yes, coppicing is not the end point. It's actually, if you coppice, you do need to go back in and keep an eye on that coop to make sure it's doing kind of what you want it to do. So in terms of the changes in woodland management is one of the declines or one of the things hitting dormice. Another is habitat fragmentation. So from a dormouse point of view, this is a picture of the view from Golden Cap in Dorset. Looks an ideal dormouse habitat where you've got these little blocks of woodland connected by hedgerows. So it's quite easy to see an arboreal animal been born in one of the woodlands, growing up with its mother in one of these woods, then becoming independent and heading out down the hedgerow network to seek pastures new. Unfortunately, I say this is Dorset. Unfortunately, in many areas, this case no longer holds, and a lot of our hedgerows are starting to either appear quite gappy. They're almost come these lollipop hedges. They're not these dense, thick, bushy hedgerows that actually are good corridors, not just for dormice, but for other animals as well. And again, this is something that almost seems to be deteriorating. So the fragmentation of our woodlands through the kind of loss or the inappropriate management of hedgerows is certainly not helping dormice, but also the habit or the woodland fragmentation by building of infrastructure, roads, railways, even housing developments, is kind of breaking up the connectivity across the countryside for a species like the dormouse to kind of get around. And finally, one other thing that's kind of hitting dormice, which I've kind of touched on, is dormice are a hibernating animal. Is what benefits them really is actually a good cold spell in winter. As I say, their body temperature reduces to ambient temperature. If it's a good cold weather, they'll drop their temperature, they'll stay in hibernation. But what we seem to be getting under climate change is warmer winters, where basically we could have a cold spell one day, it could be hot the following day, and it's that warmer spell that may bring dormice out of hibernation more frequent than they would normally. And the problem with that is that they could wake up with greater regularity, and of course, every time they wake up, they lose energy, and they've only got only so much energy, and if they wake up too much, they will simply expire. The other problem with climate change is we're starting to see wetter springs and wetter summers. And because dormice need to, as kind of successional feeders, and they need to get out and feed, dormice don't have waterproof fur. So when we start to get wetter weather, they tend not to go out and feed. And that can also negatively impact on breeding. And because they only produce 1 litter a year, they can ill afford to miss out a breeding year simply because the numbers start to drop and start to decline. So really 3 main issues really for the really hitting dormice. One is the woodland management that we now do, the habitat fragmentation in terms of not enabling them to get across the landscape, and also the climate change seems to have an impact on them as well. And the other problem, of course, as I say, there are impacts from other species. Nothing particularly predates dormice, simply because they live at very low population densities anyway. So even in an ideal habitat, you might only have 4 dormice per hectare. So they live in a pretty low density anyway. But nonetheless, in this country, we have 6 species of deer where we should only have 2. And in some areas, deer numbers are kind of getting almost out of control. And they have a serious impact on the regeneration of understory scrub, which is predominantly where dormice live. But it's not just deer. Grey squirrel numbers seem to be on the increase. We're now building more and more developments adjacent to these old woodlands where dormice are likely to be, and that increases the number of cats. And I'm probably seeing more and more cat predation, photographs of dormice. So it's a range of things really, but I must admit, I often get asked as to what predates on dormice, and in truth, the answer I say is nothing, but the one having biggest impact is almost certainly deer, not because they eat dormice, but because they eat the type of habitat we're trying to create for dormice. So, kind of big problems really for dormice. And I suppose really the question is, well, what might we do about them? How might we help this species? Because so far it all looks a bit doom and gloom, to say the least. So, how can we make coppice better? So, what can we look about in terms of woodland management? I think the key thing for dormice is connectivity, connectivity, connectivity. This is an arboreal species, and if you've got to think, you're thinking like how does an arboreal species kind of get around in your woodland? How can it get to your woodland? So how can we maintain that connectivity within a coppice coop or around a coppice coop? I mean, we could potentially do something like windrow to take material out, and actually could you then use that dead hedging to connect up or maintain connectivity between other areas of your woodland. could we take the opportunity when we cut a coppice to increase scrub or shrub diversity? Is it worth planting something different in? Perhaps have a look around at what other plants are growing in your area or in your woodland, to actually say, well, actually, could we increase the scrub or shrub diversity within that area, within the area? Basically, we've reduced the canopy, we've created good opportunity for the establishment of new plants. So actually, perhaps that's something we could do. Manage shading, most certainly. You definitely need to look as to what trees can you thin out. How do you you definitely need to see about how you get some light to the woodland floor to enable the coppice or the new plants you put in there to get away. Similarly, manage browsers. There's a number of ways you can kind of manage deer populations. One certainly is kind of fencing off areas of woodland, and one that we have used or has been used with some success is almost going to eBay and see if you can get some of that large panels of Harris fencing. So that's the stuff that builders use, and actually use that to temporarily fence your coop off. And you can move it after a couple of years when the coppice has got away, and perhaps do that to the next one. So perhaps a heavy initial outlay to start with, but it should last for many years. Well, how do you increase the coppice stall? So do you layer? Do you see about starting off with I put in Hazel Nursery there. This is an area where we've tried before, where we've actually picked an area of our woodland. We've basically laid everything that we can, and then in years to come, we'll dig up those plants and then transplant them to where we want to be. Could you use nuts from a local woodland to start regenerating some new hazel for new coops? Can you make use of the product that you take out? I mean, it seems a waste to me, really, that you cut coppice from a conservation perspective, and actually it mostly gets binned or burnt or stacked to rot down. Could we do something better with it to make it kind of more productive? I mean, there certainly seems to be a bit of resurgence in old skills, so perhaps that's something could be considered. And I just put in picture framing at the bottom. This was an idea that came up from a site in Yorkshire, where they were looking at the picture frame is retaining those old hazel stalls that will produce a lot of fruit. And actually, you do the coppice in the darker bit in the middle. So you cut the coppice in the middle, you retain the fruiting trees at the edge. Kind of gives you a bit of both for dormice. One, you get the connectivity inside, and the food sources on the outside. So again, that could be a reasonable compromise. Other things we perhaps do, we've hung on too much to coppice, thinking that actually dormice are so closely associated with coppice, but perhaps doing coppice is not really the way to go. Just thinking perhaps managing woodland rides is perhaps a more important thing, not perhaps important thing, but perhaps an easier win for dormice. So the picture there on the right-hand side is, again, this is on the Isle of Wight, but this is the side of a ride. And the reason I think looking at rides from a dormouse perspective is actually rides are easier to do. If you own a woodland, you need to manage your rides or you're not going to get into your woodland. So managing these bramble banks is actually these, if you're going to go and cut your woodland with a tractor and a flail, is actually then could we see about what might we manage and generate these bramble banks along the woodland rides, because I say bramble is excellent. This sort of linear bramble mat is excellent for dormice in terms of providing secure, safe nesting sites, providing abundant food source, and provide that connectivity through your wood that's actually easier to achieve than perhaps trying to do coppice. And it can be done on a smaller scale as well. In terms of the picture on the left-hand side is, pretty much done with a hedge trimmer, I suspect. Again, almost a footpath. I think this was actually cut with a ride-on mower, but same purpose achieved. And you've got a good bramble bank that provides good habitat for dormice and good connectivity through your woodland. Just at the bottom as well, if I've certainly seen the areas under way leaves, so under electric pylons, where are regularly cut. I've certainly been in woods where the only areas where dormice are found are where you're having them underneath the way leaves, because that's the only area of the wood that's been regularly cut, perhaps every 10 years, but it'll be cut on a regular basis, cut down so that the plants that grow up to touch the wires. And on a number of occasions, that's the area where we've found dormice. So again, perhaps we move away a bit from this idea of a coppice woodland into, ride side, or perhaps way leaves as providing, again, this kind of linear linkage, but also where dormouse conservation is not the primary concern. Also, I'm starting to wonder, actually, again, moving well away from kind of the idea of coppice, is actually, are we now seeing that probably some of the best habitats we have for dormice in the UK now are actually on roadside and rail side? Because these are two areas where actually tend not to have any high canopy trees, because for health and safety reasons, probably very low deer impacts because of the constant disturbance by cars and also by trains. So you have got, again, these long connective routes of scrubby understory that actually is not negatively impacted by herbivores or not negatively impacted by increased shading. And again, I'm starting to wonder, is in terms of actually, are these some of the best habitats we have now for Hazel Dormice? There are obviously health and safety implications around checking them, but I do start to wonder, is this an area where we should be focusing on more? Because again, it's not to manage it for dormouse conservation, but actually to manage it sympathetically, because the consequence of managing to run cars in it or run trains in it seems to produce ideal scrubby habitat that dormice like to live in. Going back to hedgerows again, I mentioned hedgerows and the fact, a lot of inappropriate hedgerow management. We're starting to do a lot of work on that now. Seems to be a real appetite for improving hedgerow quality. The message coming out very much is in terms of you need to appreciate that hedgerows are very much go on a cycle. They're quite dynamic environments. You can trim them. Year in, not quite year in, year out, but ultimately there'll come a point, perhaps every 40 or 50 years, you either need to lay them or coppice them. You need to do some sort of rejuvenation to restore this hedgerow. And a colleague of mine who works on hedgerows, I think she makes a very valid point that down in Cornwall, there are some hedges down there that are believed to be about 5,000 years old. The only reason those hedges still exist today is because once in a generation, someone took the trouble to lay them or to coppice them. So someone took the trouble for that sort of rejuvenation, and that's happened over the last 5,000 years. And of course, if you do rejuvenate a hedgerow, as in top picture, you're quite likely after a few years to end up with the sort of picture that we've got below, where you've got this lovely, diverse, dense, well-connected, bushy hedgerow that goes to the landscapes that's providing abundant nesting sites, food sources for a broad range of animals. And we don't really make a note enough of actually the benefits that hedgerows can bring. Obviously, we see them very much as have an aesthetic value within the landscape, but they can bring a lot of value to farmers as well in terms of things like soil protection and reduction of pollution, shelters for livestock, and also for crops, potential there for wood fuel if you want it, a reservoir for pest control, for predatory insects, also obviously for pollinators as well. There's a range of residual benefits in terms of saying, well, actually, we should really be looking after hedgerows much better. So I hope I've kind of showed that, or given an overview of what dormouse are, the problems they face, and let's say how you might be able to help them. I think very much dormice are a species of conservation concern. We know that both the range and populations are declining. Dormice are a native species, so that means they've been here for 10 to 12,000 years. They came across by themselves after the last ice age. So they're a native species. And I think we have a duty of responsibility to look after our native wildlife. They're very much a species of countryside, so often described as a woodland species, but I think they're a lot more than that. I think they're more a landscape species, because if they occupy all the areas within a woodland, they then need to disperse beyond that woodland. And actually, that picture I showed you of the hedges and woodlands under Golden Cap, I don't think anyone would dispute that wasn't the kind of lovely and quintessentially English landscape. And I think what is nice for dormice is actually something that we like as well. So I think there's a real value of saying, well, actually, good for dormice is good for us as well. In fact, dormice aren't pests, as I think I've said. They're actually, They're very cute species. People love to see dormice. We have got examples of where actually farmers very much have wanted dormice on their land. They value having the species there, and actually we can use that as a way to promote and drive landscape change. Is it one of our crown jewels? I think it is. We don't have that big an animal fauna in this country, but I think it is one of our crown jewels as a species in terms of the many things that make dormice very important. And I suppose the last one I'd mention as well is I've worked on dormice for 20 years, but I've never particularly liked the idea of gardening for a species. But I think the value from dormice is very much recognised as a key species. That if we get things right for dormice, we get things right for a broad range of species as well. And that kind of that dense, scrubby understory layer of woodlands, which in many woodlands we've lost, as actually means that there's fewer nesting sites for woodland birds, woodland butterflies, woodland bats, as well as dormice. So actually, if we get things right for dormice, we can actually improve our woodlands for a broad range of lots of other animals as well. Right, on that note, I will finish and see if there's any questions. I've seen Sarah scribbling frantically.
Hi, Ian. Ian, thank you so much. That was a wonderful, comprehensive talk. I have been looking at the questions as we go through. So I tell you what, we'll dip into the questions now. Ian, are you able to see the questions? Because there's a photo that you need to see in order to answer a question.
Oh, I do. Okay, hang on. What do I need to open chat then?
And if not, I can work around it. So basically, this is a question from someone called David, and
yeah,
he wants to know if these little things are dormice nests.
Very small picture. I would say looking likely. But if you could send those to me, if I give you my email address, I'm happy to send me the full size image and also location as well.
Okay, yeah, it's in. I believe, is it in Suffolk, David? I will forward it along, and I will do the correspondence behind the scenes.
From what I can see, I would looking quite likely. If they're in Suffolk, we know, or we think we know, where all the populations are in Suffolk. So it will be very interesting to see in terms of if these the location you have is from where we'd expect them to see, or is it potentially a novel population? That would be interesting.
Okay, I will perhaps even get back to you on that before the end of this. So we've answered Peter. They are only found in the south of the country, with an exception in Cumbria. How are winter?
Well, not entirely true. They are pretty much still throughout Wales.
Okay.
Other than Cumbria, the most northerly populations are in Shropshire.
Right. Okay. How are winter weather changes affecting hibernation success? Is suitable food available during the hibernation interruptions?
So dormice don't. Okay, so hibernation has always been a challenging period of dormice life to study, simply because the way we used to study and still do to a great degree is you catch a dormice, you put a radio collar around its neck, let it go again, and then basically you track it to its hibernation site. And once you've tracked it, you can then keep a track on how much it's coming and going. So obviously the problem, you don't actually know when a dormouse is going to go into hibernation. Is the first problem. So you could you could track it for 2 months, and then your battery runs out, and then you've got to try and catch the thing again to actually replace it. So hibernation has always been a challenging period, but we are starting to get a little bit more information out now. So what seems to come from hibernation studies is that dormice generally don't eat when they're hibernating. So they build up their fat reserves prior to going to hibernation. But what one study down in Exeter found that if there is late litters, so it may be in some circumstances females can have another litter, but it actually means the litters then move into quite late, so perhaps even into November. But actually then, because dormice won't go into hibernation unless they reach a suitable weight that they're likely to survive, which is probably about 18 grams, they may well not hibernate at all and keep feeding on. Now, what they feed on in that at the moment is unknown, because generally, if you look around a woodland in the middle of winter, there's actually no food available apart perhaps from some invertebrates. So quite what their food source they're finding It's possible there is a paper written in the 1970s, I think it was, where they did pick up dormice eating very young buds on trees. So it's before the cellulose are particularly hardened off, is actually the very young buds. So whether that would be provide a sufficient food source for a young dormouse, who knows? But generally, so the answer, I suppose, the question is generally when hibernating, they won't eat during hibernation, but sometimes it appears that very young dormice won't hibernate until they get to a sufficient weight, in which case they might be feeding quite late. Hopefully that answers the question. I think it does.
Yeah, I think so too. This question is from me, actually. It's more to do with the cuteness of them rather than the conservation side. But I noticed in your photos, some have fairy tails and some don't. Is it a gender, age, or a variation thing?
No, so they all have furry tails. Hazel Dormice are our only small mammal with a furry tail.
Yeah,
So because people want to see them, it's a standard question we always ask. We very rarely take dormouse records unless we have a photograph, unless we have a footprint, unless we have a nut. But when people are reporting dormice, we always ask what the tails look like.
right.
So dormice are our only species to have a furry tail. Sometimes it's less furry, and as they get older, it seems to become more furry and more bushy. So perhaps more obvious in some of the photographs. But they all have furry tails.
Okay. Some of these questions were typed and then you answered them in your presentation. Is it possible to tell if dormice are underfoot hibernating or worry about treading on them?
No, it's impossible. It's impossible. There's one or two hints to their hibernation sites. Generally, they appear to hibernate within kind of their active range. They appear to hibernate on slopes at times, which may be a defense mechanism against flooding. But I've also heard that they also seem to hibernate in relatively exposed situations. So where you'd perhaps expect them under a log pile underneath the base of a hedge, you then find they're actually hibernating out into the 10 feet away from the base of the hedge, in essence, in the middle of a field. And the reason for that probably is so when they're hibernating, they'll still be breathing, albeit at a very slow rate, but they're still losing water. So likely they're hibernating in exposed conditions so they don't desiccate. So actually they stay damp. But I remember having this question many years ago. I was doing some work in Berkshire, and I was talking to a group of people about management of old hazels. And this woman was standing afar, getting very upset in terms of, you might be standing on hazel dormice, and she kind of missed the point. Is actually we were talking about woodland management, and ultimately because it's a woodland animal, because when you're managing woodland, you've got to walk on the woodland, you've got to fell trees, you've got to do certain things. But what you're aiming at is actually how do you improve things for the species? You're looking to how do you improve things for the population, not how do you manage an individual. So there are, say, certain precautions, and we would always advise do woodland work between November and March, when dormice are like to be hibernating rather than in the breeding season. Keep fire sites to a minimum, keep pathways to a minimum to avoid trampling all over the place. But ultimately, there's a possibility you will harm dormice. But what you're looking to do is actually make it better for the population in the longer term.
Thank you. Neil asks, would an 8-hectare hazel coop in an 8-year rotation be an ideal habitat for dormice, or do you need older areas, 10 to 20 years overstood areas?
I never like the idea of overstood coppice, simply because overstood kind of implies your coop's kind of broken down a bit. That I kind of think that potentially comes under that picture I showed you, a picture framing. If you can retain some of those older stalls, they will probably be more productive fruiting wise. But at some point they will need to be cut and coppice. And I think the trees that tend to be most productive seem to be ones that have getting older and have more affected more by the light that's coming in, so they're not particularly shaded out. So in terms of you asked for what, so yeah, I think it's trying to get that balance as to what you want your coppice to do, and also retain some of the older trees, but recognizing you'll have to coppice them at some point. It's how to maintain that connectivity. And the other thing you can do as a sort of a management for older coppice is often what will happen. You'll get one or two branches growing out towards the light. Well, you could actually take those branches off that are unbalanced in the stall to just to maintain a nicely balanced stall that's productive and old, but it's still kind of connected and it's not going to pull itself out the ground because you've just balanced it up.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Another Ian. God, what was the collective noun for Ian's? Are there any relocation programs to suitably manage woodland to stem the range of shrinkage or to establish viable populations in the most favourable habitat?
Yes. So the answer really is to the first one is yes. The answer to the second one is no. What we do is promote a suitable woodland habitat, or suitable woodland management, really, or how do we get better woodland management? But yeah, there is a dormouse reintroduction program that's been running since 1993. I've managed it since 2013, and we generally look to do one reintroduction a year. Currently, we're working on trying to get dormice back in the national forest in the Midlands, and we did a reintroduction there last year, and we're looking to do another one this year. But yes, there's an ongoing program that's been running for 30 years
In
to
the
try and
Midlands, which in
restore.
the East or West Midlands? Just
This one's going to be in it's where it's wherever the national forest is. So it's around
East Midlands.
Derbyshire, Leicestershire.
Yeah,
That's near you, isn't it?
that's my stomping ground. Yeah.
Which
Not
I think
too much
wouldn't that be, if we can get that done in kind of 20, 30 years, that'd be very exciting, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's cool. I've got friends who work for the National Forest. Okay, right. Someone asks, referring back to a previous part of your webinar, a couple of people have asked, what do you mean by gap up? Do you mean like fill in the gaps?
Yes.
Like a
So
patchy
if you're running a commercial coppice, and that's basically where coppicing kind of started, it's been a highly productive woodland management. But basically, if you're running a productive hazel coppice, you'd probably look to have no more than 6 to 8 feet between stalls. And yet over time, certainly in the presence of deer, of course, stalls will die if you're cutting them regularly. Some stalls will die. Certainly in the presence of deer, you get more. So it's actually maintaining that stall density within your coop. And obviously, if you maintain that stall density, you'll at least maintain or enhance the connectivity. So really, in a hazel coop, you'll be looking for gaps of around about 6 to 8 feet.
Okay, thank you. Well, one question here. You said the gestation period of a dormouse is
about a month.
Yeah, and how long do dormice live?
On average, 3 years in the wild, up to 5 years, and have been known to live up to 7 years in captivity.
Oh, okay. Okay. So good wood. Yeah, someone commented this was in response to what you were saying at the time, that good woodland management includes ride management, so scallop edges and brambles, etc. None of us woodland owners enjoy doing too much with brambles because they're so scratchy.
Well, they are, but they're also an absolutely fabulous plant. And I suppose because your members, when we were looking at kind of the ride management, is the point really is actually you need to keep your rides open because you're not going to get into wood otherwise. So while you're keeping the rides open, could you manage the ride edge at the same time? Because there's real benefits for that. Say not just for dormice, but also in terms of nice sunny areas for increase your carrying capacity for woodland butterflies, for example. And we've lost a lot of woodland birds because we're missing out this understory layer, and we're thinking about the ride side edges, because perhaps while you're cutting your ride perhaps you create a bit more space and allow the bramble to come back in.
Yeah. So Ian I think you've inspired some proactivity in Ian Hannah. This is a receptive audience referring to us. Any hopeful signs of traction with the messages to the NFU or maybe organic farmers?
I think, well, we started, and it actually came out of the reintroduction program, that we actually were looking at. So the idea of the reintroduction moved from kind of finding a woodland, doing a dormouse reintroduction in it, not quite walking away, but saying, well, that was the end of it. And about 2013 or so, when I took over, we then started doing at least 2, if not 3 reintroductions in an area. We're looking at how do we improve the habitat connectivity between them, which is predominantly looking at hedgerows. Very quickly came to the conclusion there was no easy way of quantifying or giving a quantitative measure on hedgerow quality. So at which point we took over we took over a DEFRA server that was existing at the time, plus looked at some other ones and actually developed a hedgerow project based around how we manage hedgerows. So that's the PTS have been doing that for 3 or 4 years now. And I must admit, my colleague who delivers on that program, she's just constantly delivering talks and to landowners, farmers. So I would say it's not just, I would say there's a lot of interest in hedgerows of how to improve hedgerow quality and how to improve hedgerow connectivity. Notwithstanding government's targets in terms of that we need to be planting something like 40,000 kilometres of hedgerows by 2050, which is interesting. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, so that's one thing that came out of it. I mean, People's Trust for Endangered Species is a relatively small charity. So it's basically how do we get best bang for our buck? And I must admit, I'm very pleased with the hedgerow project, as I think it's having quite a significant impact.
Yeah. So I think some people are. Yeah. Oh, Rebecca is asking, can we have a link to that hedgerow quality program? I tell you what, we've got some more questions, and I think what would be best is if I compile the questions in an email to you, Ian, and then I'll feed back to the members, because we're sort of pushed for time. But the rest of the comments are really people thanking you for your wonderful talk. I think you've even inspired our return swogger Ben Davis to move from fungus to he's thinking of maybe being interested in dormice. But I
You
would like
wouldn't be
to,
alone.
yeah, I think you've I'm just sorry that they're not too prevalent in our area, but like you say, give it some time. I don't like to pit my webinar speakers against one another, but Ian, I thought you would perhaps like to know that with 73 attendees, you are currently on my leaderboard for gold spot. So sorry, Ben, you've been nudged down to silver.
Well, I hope everyone found it informative and helpful.
Yeah, I think I can speak on behalf of all of us. I can see by the nods. I think, yeah, we really did. Thank you so much for your time, Ian. It was an excellent talk.
Very welcome. And I'd say if anyone is interested, I'd say, and certainly the hedgerow work is, it's on the PTS website. I can certainly send you a link for that.
Okay. If there's anything that you would like for us to pop in our newsletter, we send it out on the 1st of every month, Ian. If you want to, we're always happy to share stuff for you. So thank you so much.
Okay, lovely.
All right then.
Thank you.
Cheerio,
Thank you for
everybody.
inviting me.
Thanks for attendance.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.